February 25, 2011, Serpukhov, Russia. Nadezhda Filatova was returning from the store with her purchases when she suddenly heard an unpleasant sound coming from the stairs, as if someone was shuffling their shoes on concrete. A minute later, she saw her neighbor. Half-naked Oksana looked like a ghost. She reeked of alcohol, and water streamed down from her torn clothing. Oksana stepped over the threshold and immediately collapsed onto the floor. Oksana was a college student. According to neighbors and teachers, she was modest and diligent. However, emergency room doctors found all the signs of a drug overdose in Oksana. Did she take the substances herself, or was someone influencing her? Why, in the middle of winter, was the girl undressed and water dripping from her body? And, as it turned out, she wasn't wearing any underwear. As will be revealed later, the student became one of the victims of a monster that had broken free. The doctors reported to the police department that a girl had arrived in a coma with signs of poisoning. Hospital staff said the patient, in a delirious state, was pleading for mercy and moaning at the sight of a male doctor. Soon after, she fell into a deeper coma. The investigator learned from relatives that Oksana Vasilyeva is the eldest daughter of a large family. The girl was hurrying home after college classes to change her grandmother's caregiver. However, Oksana did not arrive at the appointed time. A medical examination showed that the girl had been subjected to violence, and her blood contained a mixture of various medications. The detectives noticed an important detail. According to the witness, Oksana was descending the stairs, yet the girl lived several floors below. Why, after entering the entrance hall, did the student pass her own floor and go up higher? The experts carefully examined the elevator cabin and found that some of the elevator buttons bore no fingerprints at all. The cleaner was not on duty at that time. Who else could have wiped the buttons clean? And why? There could be only one explanation. The perpetrator erased his handprints from the elevator buttons and other surfaces at the crime scene. This indicated that he had prepared meticulously and knew exactly which traces the forensic specialists would be looking for. On the landing between the 16th and 17th floors, the detectives discovered a clear palm imprint on the wall, and on the floor beneath it, a clump of long light brown hair, exactly the kind Oksana has. This time, however, the investigation was preoccupied not with what had been found, but with what was missing from the entrance hall. The victim's black tights and underwear, which she had been wearing that day, had disappeared. The investigators searched all the trash cans in the vicinity. Then a new hypothesis arose. What if the attacker were a fetishist, and the victim's personal items provoked a special reaction in him? According to the forensic report, the student was not merely assaulted. The perpetrator did everything possible to prevent the girl from calling for help. Traces of adhesive bandage were found on Oksana's lips, and a mixture of medication and vodka was discovered in her stomach. Moreover, the dose she was forced to ingest was lethal. The fact that Oksana managed to summon the strength to seek help was nothing short of a miracle. The results of the fingerprint analysis were discouraging. The palm print on the wall was clear, but it did not belong to the assailant. It was Oksana's own hand. No DNA of the perpetrator could be located anywhere. Fortunately, 2 days later, Oksana Vasilyeva regained consciousness. Her account surprised the detectives. As she approached the entrance hall, Oksana noticed a man in black glasses and a cap walking behind her, tapping a white cane for the visually impaired. The elderly man was limping with a cane. Wanting to help the disabled person, Oksana held the door open and assisted him up the steps. Together, they waited for the elevator. But as soon as the cabin started moving, the frail man suddenly saw. He pulled out a knife, pressed it to the girl's throat, and stopped the lift. The girl froze in terror when, suddenly, a voice came over the elevator's intercom. The dispatcher asked why the lift had stopped and whether the passenger was all right. The attacker replied that he was an old man who had simply pressed the wrong button. A glimmer of hope sparked in Oksana. Perhaps the dispatcher had startled the assailant. Instead, he roughly pulled the girl out of the elevator onto the landing of the top floor, a place where the chance of encountering other people was minimal. He had a syringe filled with an unknown substance, which he forced the girl to drink, and then sealed her mouth with a bandage. Oksana was terrified, but she memorized his scent and his impeccably polished shoes, shiny, pointed-toe shoes. According to the girl, the man reeked strongly of shoe polish and a valerian tincture. Investigators naturally asked themselves, why would a sturdy middle-aged man be using medication? While anyone can buy valerian extract at a pharmacy, tranquilizers are prescribed only by a doctor and can be obtained only with a prescription. Detectives checked every nearby pharmacy and then every pharmacy in the city. They reviewed all the surveillance footage and questioned every pharmacist. It later became clear why Oksana's clothes were wet. When the assault ended, the pretended blind man took a bottle of water out of his bag, poured it over the girl, and ordered her to wipe herself thoroughly with her own clothes. This method of concealing evidence led the detectives to think that the perpetrator had planned the crime in advance, had considered how and where it would take place, and had thought out how to get rid of the evidence. They assumed the rapist was not a novice, had committed similar offenses before, and possessed a fairly high level of intelligence. He forced the girl to count to 100, and while she was counting, the attacker calmly left the crime scene. The investigators requested access to the surveillance cameras, and indeed one of them captured a man, matching the description leaving the courtyard at exactly the hour Oksana was attacked. The man could not be identified because the recording was of low quality and the subject was far from the camera. Oksana could not answer the question of where her underwear had disappeared to. After the attacker poured a mixture of medicines and vodka into her, everything around her seemed like a fog. She even called a neighbor's apartment by mistake, thinking it was her own. Oksana's recollection of the attacker's face was vague, but she described his general facial features, and on the basis of that information, the police produced a composite sketch. The young woman was very shy about telling the investigator the details of what had happened, but he managed to put her at ease, and what the victim finally disclosed surprised even the most seasoned officers. The perpetrator was wearing gray-colored thong-style underwear. Police began checking lingerie shops. A large man with a round face and a gray cap did not enter any of them. Young people are often poor at estimating others' ages. According to the student, the attacker was older than her parents, but younger than her grandfather. Investigators concluded that the rapist from Serpukhov was about 40 years old, dressed in a red jacket and jeans. He wore opaque sunglasses, typically used by people who have lost their sight. and hid his face behind them, also pulling a cap down over his forehead. Police canvassed all nearby houses and uncovered useful information. A shop assistant had seen a suspicious middle-aged man in her store. He wanted to buy underwear, specifically a bra and briefs. When the assistant asked what size his wife wore, he replied that his wife was just like the shop assistant herself. The strange buyer kept looking around, feeling the lace and smoothing the silk on the mannequins. His behavior struck the shop assistant as abnormal, and detectives located and questioned the man. It turned out that he really was buying a gift for his spouse. His alibi was confirmed. At the time of the assault on the student, the lace underwear enthusiast was at work, and there was no bright red jacket in his wardrobe. The detectives found a witness who had seen a man matching the description, wearing dark glasses and a red jacket. The criminal was slowly wandering the street near the college, tapping a stick as if he were blind. The witness noticed that the strange cripple's stick had neither a tip nor a handle. Instead, it featured an odd attachment in the middle. Moreover, this cripple kept turning his head from side to side. News of the dangerous blind spread throughout the district. Parents became afraid to let their children go to school alone. Victoria and Svetlana knew about the incident involving a girl from their neighborhood, but they were convinced that together they could stand up to the attacker. The girls approached their building's entrance. Victoria saw a man walking toward them with a bouquet of flowers. The girls politely held the door open so the man wouldn't have to ring the intercom. After a few steps, the friends would realize that this was their fatal mistake. A signal to the control panel of the company that services the elevators was sent at 14:10. The duty operator asked what had happened. A male voice replied, "Sorry, I'm an elderly person and I pressed the wrong button." A few minutes later, another signal came from the same address, but this time nobody answered. The duty operator assumed the children were being mischievous and threatened to call the police. In response, she heard the same male voice. "Don't call the police. Everything is fine." The elevator started working again, and after a while, the call finally reached the police dispatch. The parents of the two students reported that their daughters had been attacked in the elevator. Victoria Besanova and Svetlana Zarkova, third-year university students, lived in the same entrance. Criminal investigators examined the lift. It was drenched in blood. Perhaps this time they will be able to find the perpetrator's DNA at the scene. Yes, it was blood, but it belonged to one of the victims, not to the attacker. The girls said the man was of solid build and tall stature. He was wearing a baseball cap. The girls pressed the elevator button, and when they entered the lift, the man followed them inside. The students reported that as soon as the cabin started to rise, the man threw away the flowers, pressed the stop button, and a knife appeared in his hand. Without any warning, the criminal swung the knife. Victoria, trying to protect herself, raised her hand to shield her face. The knife scratched the wrist of that hand, and blood began to flow from it. That wound saved Victoria. The attacker paid no further attention to the blood-stained girl. He focused on Svetlana, ordered her to take off her coat and spread it on the elevator floor, cut her underwear and stockings with the knife, and forced the girl onto her knees. Why did the attacker choose Svetlana out of the two girls of the same age? Long-haired brunette Svetlana was dressed in a coat, a dress, and black stockings. Why did the criminal wound the blonde Victoria but not touch her? Was it simply because Victoria was injured? But the first victim, Oksana Vasilyeva, also had long dark hair and black stockings. Coincidence? Or is there a connection? When everything was over, the maniac left the elevator on the 5th floor and sent the cabin with the victims upward. The perpetrator left no personal items behind. No fingerprints, no biological material, nothing that the investigators could obtain. In both the first and the second case, the man took the victim's underwear, which he cut with a knife and slipped into the pockets of his clothing. He reproduced the actions he had carried out during the attack on Oksana Vasilyeva point for point. However, this time, apparently feeling immune from punishment, he decided to take not only the women's undergarments, but also more valuable items. The criminal stole the girls' jewelry, gold rings, earrings, chains, and also took both of their mobile phones. But this time, the attacker's vigilance slipped. He didn't notice that he had been caught on the street camera lens above the entrance. Here are the frames. A tall, solid-built man with a beer belly. His eyes and forehead hidden by glasses and a cap, a slightly drooping chin, a round face, and classic, polished-to-a-shine boots. Exactly the description given by the first victim, Oksana, a bouquet of flowers. Those were what dulled the alertness of the two students. Later, detectives found that bouquet in a nearby trash can with drops of blood on a piece of cellophane. Now the investigators knew what the maniac looked like. But where to find him? Police compared the footage from the street camera with photos from the criminal database of the city of Serpukhov. But no suspect matched. Then the description of the perpetrator was sent out to all neighboring districts. Detectives noticed that the houses where the attacks on the girls took place were all at the same distance from the railway station. What if the perpetrator was not a local resident, but a visitor? The investigator correlated the times of the crimes, known to the minute from the elevator stop dispatcher logs, with the train schedule. At that time, the offender could have come from Moscow or from Tula. But that information alone was insufficient. Another clue remained: the phones stolen from the victims. The investigators contacted a mobile operator company and learned that the stolen phones were moving in the direction of Moscow. But the signal was lost halfway. The police decided to widen the search area and requested data on all convicted rapists from neighboring regions. They checked every recently released inmate, but this yielded no results. Then the investigators decided to appeal to the city's residents for help. On the one hand, such an appeal could cause panic among the population. On the other hand, any means were acceptable to stop the attacks on the girls. A video capturing the perpetrator was broadcast in the media, including on television, so that anyone who had seen the man or possessed any information could report it to the investigators. A flood of phone calls slammed the detectives of the Serpukhov Criminal Investigation Department. They did not expect calls from many stores, nor from women. But there were also important messages. Lyuba Tikhonova told the police her story. On 10th April, 3 days after the assault on 2 students, she was returning home with her cat from a veterinary clinic. A blind man, tapping his cane, entered the building right after her. But he hesitated, and a heavy door pressed his back. A glass shattered. A strong smell of valerian filled the air. The cat screamed loudly and lunged at the blind man. The man instantly regained his sight, snatched Lyuba's bag from her hands, and bolted out of the entrance like a bullet. It turned out that the pet saved Lyuba from an attack in the elevator. Investigators learned that the bag the perpetrator had taken from Lyuba contained a mobile phone. Its signal was soon detected in Moscow, in the Tsaritsino district. Near the signal source was a railway platform from which an electric train regularly departed for Serpukhov. The train arrived at its destination at about 12 p.m., which meant the attacker had enough time to walk the kilometer from the station to the houses where his victims lived. Operatives headed to Moscow and, at the Tsaritsino station, noticed a utility store next to the platform. On the shop's counter, they saw an item that matched the detailed description given by a young witness. The item was a bathroom rail, a hollow lightweight tube with caps on both ends. The criminal had used the bathroom rail to deceive his victims. The detectives realized they were on the right track. The offender lives in Moscow, most likely in the Tsaritsino district. While the police were checking the database of all previously convicted persons for similar crimes, the department received a phone call. The call came from a retired investigator. He reported that in the 1990s, he had investigated a criminal case in which a maniac committed analogous offenses, but within the city of Moscow. The former law enforcement officer claimed that, on the footage he had seen on federal television, the perpetrator was none other than Oleg Kosarev, a repeat rapist. But could that be true? More than 15 years had passed. What if the colleague had been mistaken? The investigator requested the old case files from the archive. Indeed, the photographs showed a man who looked like Kosarev, although not as round-faced. After 15 years, however, he could have gained weight. The modus operandi was exactly the same. By now, the detectives no longer doubted that it was Oleg Kosarev, 45 years old, convicted 4 times for violent offenses, and currently registered at a psychiatric hospital. Kosarev is divorced, has a daughter, and lives in his mother's apartment in Moscow. He committed his first rape at the age of 18 and was then sent for compulsory treatment to a psychiatric facility, where, together with an accomplice, he raped a nurse. In 1984, a court sentenced Oleg Kosarev to 8 years of imprisonment. Kosarev was released in June 1992, and just a month and a half later, committed another assault. His usual pattern was to stalk teenage girls on the street, follow them into a building's entrance hall, and then, in the elevator, threaten them with a knife while raping them and robbing them. To lull his victims into a false sense of security, the criminal sometimes pretended to be blind. The peak of Kosarev's criminal activity occurred in the autumn of 1995, when Moscow experienced up to 3 similar attacks on children per day. In one instance, Kosarev caught 5 teenagers in an elevator and, threatening them with a knife, committed unlawful acts. During this period, Oleg Kosarev got married and worked as a night watchman at a kindergarten. For some reason, nobody checked his background. His wife, up until the moment of his arrest, was unaware of his crimes and described her husband as a romantic, gallant man. On 31st October 1995, Kosarev was detained while trying to sell stolen items, including a camera that had been taken from one of his victims just 4 hours earlier. Kosarev confessed to 140 rapes. But the court recognized 40 episodes as proven because many victims refused to cooperate with the investigation. In March 1997, the court sentenced Kosarev to 15 years in prison. While serving his sentence, Kosarev married a second time. He met his wife during a prison date. In 2002, a daughter was born to Kosarev. However, shortly thereafter, His wife learned about the crimes for which he was incarcerated and broke off the relationship. In October 2010, Kosarev was released, and less than 6 months later, he committed another crime. According to a former investigator, the maniac should still have been behind bars in another part of the country. How did he end up free? Detectives traced his current whereabouts. It turned out that 6 months before the new offense, Kosarev was released early for good behavior. He served 12 years of a 15-year sentence. But his pathological drive did not abandon him. Only 4 months after his release, the rapist began assaulting women again. His first victim was Oksana Vasilyeva. The criminal assumed that, because he lived in Moscow, nothing tied him to the city of Serpukhov. So he began looking for victims where the police would not be looking. He would board a train at the Tsaritsino station and arrive in Serpukhov precisely when school classes were ending. On 21st April 2011, 2 weeks after the attack on Victoria and Svetlana, police knocked on Oleg Kosarev's apartment door. An elderly woman, Kosarev's mother, opened the door. During the search, she actively impeded the detectives. She appeared to be mentally unstable. The first thing the officers saw after crossing the threshold were shoes polished to an almost black shine. The central feature of the maniac's room was a shelf filled with medicines. There, too, a syringe was found, the one the perpetrator had used during the assault on his first victim, Oksana Vasilyeva. Also on the shelf lay his props: dark sunglasses and a curtain rod for a shower curtain. In a separate box, the maniac carefully stored cut-up pieces of his victim's underwear. The drugs Kosarev used to drug his victims were prescribed to him by a doctor for a personality disorder. Both his behavior during the search and throughout the investigation suggested that he showed no remorse for his crimes. Kosarev told the detectives that his strongest emotions were provoked by beautiful lingerie, especially black stockings and lace. That is why he left Victoria alone. Her bleeding hand had nothing to do with it. He simply did not like her light-colored knit underwear. He also told the police that when he saw his victim suffering, he felt euphoric, and everything else was erased from his memory. Kosarev tried to convince investigators that he suffered from a split personality and that he heard a voice telling him what to do. He reminded the investigator that he had once been hospitalized in a psychiatric facility. But a psychiatric examination concluded that Oleg Kosarev was competent. He understood what he was doing and the consequences of his actions. The court sentenced Kosarev to 20 years of imprisonment. Thank you for watching the video to the end. To support the channel, please like, subscribe, and leave comments. We have many interesting stories.